Welcome to One Day in Transformation, the podcast where we explore how individuals and organizations redefine what's possible by embracing change. Today we're joined by Neil Milliken, a global leader in accessibility and inclusive technology. For over 2 decades, Neil has shaped policies, built communities, and driven systemic change, most recently as VP and Global Head of Accessibility at Atos. He's also the co-founder of Access, a global community dedicated to breaking down barriers through technology. Neil, your work proves that accessibility isn't just about compliance, it's about unlocking innovation for over 1 billion people worldwide. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you today.
Thanks a lot for taking the time, Neil. And let's just directly jump into our first question, which leads a bit of probably our listeners to understand who you are, and beside our introduction. You've described your mission as making the world a better place by embedding inclusive practices into complex organizations. What's, from your point of view and from your experience, the most unexpected lesson you've learned about how accessibility fuels transformation?
I've had lots of lessons over 25 years in the space. And I think that one of them is that there was not much of a connection between how businesses operate and how accessibility, the disability community, and the technologists that are behind the technologies that help people operate. And so one of my missions has been to close that gap between the two schools of thought and the two sets of practices, because it, for me, was really quite divorced. And so that was somewhat surprising, because I could see the benefits, but neither of the sort of two camps really spoke each other's language. And so for me, that was an area that I was somewhat surprised at, and it's an area that I'm still trying to close the gaps on.
It reminds me a bit of what we are doing, and it has a bit of similarities to sustainability, obviously. So different languages and different understandings on both areas. But quickly jumping to your past in regard of your roles, you've held the roles from technical architecture to global policy leader. How did your early experience, so like building in Atos, the Center of Excellence, shape your belief that accessibility is really a business imperative and not a niche?
Well, I'd actually been working in the field of assistive technology for 10 years before that, and had been working in a profitable small to medium enterprise. So I knew it worked. I knew that it was actually good business, and I could see that it was helping people. So I was already convinced by the time that I landed in the technical architect role at Siemens, which then merged into Atos. So I already came preformed with some ideas that I thought it was a good thing. What I wasn't really prepared for was the complexity of large organizations and the enormity of a task of then really taking the deployment and embedding of assistive technologies and the practices and the policies and the know-how, and really turning that into something that works in really large, complex, multicultural, multinational organizations. That, for me, was a long journey of learning, and it's one that we continue on to this day.
And I was going to say that I think it's never over. I mean, that's the type of a journey which I think all of us working with, either as employees or with a customer in large corporations, which we always have to face. I mean, the complexity, it's not getting less, it's getting even more. And from time to time, being influenced by outside aspects, I don't know, the global situation and all the insecurity in the world. Did your work in Atos change with influences like now we've seen recently, different type of leaders in the world and different type of relationships? Or is that something, if it comes to, and why I'm asking that question is, for sustainability, it had a massive influence. I mean, it was just 2 years back, it was ranked everywhere on top one, and everybody was hiring sustainability people like crazy. And then out of a sudden, with geopolitical aspects and changes, it immediately dropped more or less to zero, and people got rid of their jobs, and people had to reassign to different type of opportunities. Is that something which was effective for accessibility as well, or is that something which did not hit in that remark because of the situation remained?
So it absolutely did impact on programs that are related to inclusion, because and accessibility is certainly impacted as part of that sort of seismic political shift in the US. Let's be honest, it's in the US mainly,
Mainly,
where overnight, pretty much, there was a hurried deprioritization of all things that were considered to be woke, and accessibility was one of those, because actually one of the first things that the incoming government did was to say that they wanted to cancel all DEIA initiatives, and the A was the accessibility. So my colleagues in the US have spent years going, everybody forgets about disability and diversity and inclusion initiatives, and so they depended the A on, and then suddenly, as a result of that, then accessibility also got wrapped up into the sort of the backlash that came. So there was a deprioritization, certainly in federal programs, and that sent a signal to businesses. Not all businesses decided to act upon that signal, and there has been a great deal of variance in how businesses have responded to the sort of approaches to diversity and inclusion. So, if you look at Costco, they stood firm and they've benefited. They had a proposition that their shareholders rejected any deprioritization of inclusion initiatives, but other organizations have deprioritized. The colleagues that I had working in federal government roles, all of those roles pretty much disappeared. And then it impacted in the developing world significantly. So 2025, you had the Global Disability Summit in Berlin, and one of the biggest topics at that was the cancellation of USAID budget, because that meant that the match funding from all of the other sort of overseas development corporations suddenly evaporated as well. So then that meant that many of the programs that were working on inclusion and to a certain extent accessibility, suddenly their funding evaporated. So yes, it had a huge impact. At the same time, in Europe, in 2025, you had the European Accessibility Act coming into force. So we're in a two-speed world now, where federal America and so on is somewhat deprioritizing, and then semi-federal Europe, not quite federal Europe, has decided that it wants to prioritize this and is enforcing accessibility regulations. So what we're seeing is an acceleration of accessibility in Europe and a change of scope and focus in the US and in some multinational organizations. So interestingly, state governments are still prioritizing accessibility because they've got requirements that they have to meet under the Title II of the ADA. So 2026 is the deadline there. And so suddenly there's lots of activity back in the US around accessibility. I think the other thing that's happened is that because accessibility is seen as technical and disability sort of aspects of it are not really the main aspects that were facing scrutiny, organizations have been saying, well, actually, this is an area where we're able to still do stuff. And so we can focus on the technical things and less on sort of positioning. And there's a lot that we can do on those sort of technical programs to still keep things going. So it then changes focus, and it's more about disability innovation. So you've seen the sort of the rebranding of some of the work, depending on where you are in the world.
Right. And I mean, we'll come to that in a later stage as well. But just already as a comment, I hope that more and more companies, in particular over here in Europe, do see that as an opportunity, as even an advantage on the market, and economically with advantages if they do focus and if they don't push that out of their agendas. And I mean, you've given the example of Costco in the US, which still keeps things up on the agenda and has now an advantage. So, but let's come to that in a later point.
Yes. So next question. So you have worked across sectors, so from tech to nonprofits like the World Institute on Disability. What was a cultural or systemic barrier that you have repeatedly faced, and how did you overcome it?
So I think one of the cultural barriers are the different models of disability. So depending on where you are in the world, there are different approaches to disability. And so there's two common models of disability are the social model, which sort of came out of the UK, and the medical model of disability. And Germany is really interesting in that it's quite medicalized in its approach. So you go and get a prescription for your assistive tech. You go to the doctor to get all of these things done. Whereas actually your word for accessibility is actually social model. It's barrier-frei. Yeah. So it's actually about the reduction and removal of barriers to participation in work and society. So what you've got is the reality on the ground, and then actually a will to move towards a more social model. Both of these models have challenges because the medical model doesn't really reflect people's value that they can add in society if they have the right support. And the social model sometimes doesn't recognize that people's impairments and illnesses have an impact beyond just the impact of the barriers. So where we've tried to do this stuff is we've tried to apply the what's called the biopsychosocial model of disability, which recognizes that both people's lived experiences and conditions can have an impact, but that you're trying to also remove the barriers to full participation in society. And I know it trips off the tongue. You'll be chatting away about the biopsychosocial model of disability over dinner for sure, but actually those kind of differences do mean that how you address the topics in different countries is manifestly different.
Super interesting. I never thought about that, but
about these two models. Yeah, that's super interesting. So these two perspectives.
Just driven by the wording. I mean, yes, you're totally right. Barrierefreiheit, so the German word for that. I mean, that already gives an indication of how we treat things. Absolutely amazing. So sticking with a very practical example, and I know that a lot of our listeners out there might not have too much of touch points had in the past in regard of accessibility, inclusion, barrier-free, whatever that might be. And even more, I think it's important to bring it down. And that's what the purpose of that podcast is for, to bring it down to a tangible level and to give concrete examples to make things understandable. So during your work at Atos, the global accessibility standards, which you define, influence procurement worth hundreds of millions annually. But you have probably a very concrete example where inclusive design led maybe to a breakthrough, whether in cost savings or user experience or market reach at that time.
So there's several, and I set our policies. I didn't actually set our standards. We followed internationally recognized standards because actually for accessibility, you want stuff to be interoperable. So following open standards like the W3C's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines makes good sense. Obviously, when you're using non-web software, you have to follow other standards. And for that, there's the snappily titled EN 301549, which is the European standard, which is what the European Accessibility Act requires. So,
by the way, just to our listeners not knowing what that is all about, we'll put that in the show notes and put a link to that, and you can read through if you're interested. So
it's a cure for insomnia. There's a good couple of 100 pages there. So so we follow those standards and we try to adhere to those standards. But we were buying billions of euros worth of software and hardware and so on every year. And so what we were doing is we were actually renegotiating procurement contracts to include accessibility, do maturity assessments of our suppliers, etc. And during those processes, we quite often encountered some pushback and resistance, and we stood firm on some of those. And I can't go into details because I'm no longer there, and that's private. But we had some successes where, by standing firm, suppliers actually changed their practices and their ways of working, and put in place their own accessibility programs. So we had this sort of ecosystem effect. And then in terms of productivity, well, accessibility tools are productivity tools. For myself, I'm dyslexic. I use speech recognition a lot. I'm far, far faster at dictating than I am at typing. And actually a lot of people use speech recognition as a productivity tool and not as, an assistive tech. I believe all good tech should be assistive. So by deploying assistive tech in a sort of ubiquitous manner, you're actually giving across organizations of tens or hundreds of thousands of people productivity gains across those organizations, and time is money.
Absolutely. And maybe that's I think a very good point in time to probably step back or take two steps back even, and explaining what accessibility per definition even means, maybe in just one to two sentences, because I've experienced that myself. If you talk about accessibility, there is always a picture which is being created in people's minds. But the fact is exactly as you said it. I mean, you're way faster in speaking than in typing. And even that is accessibility features. Or if I'm required to carry, I don't know, a baby on one arm and my purchase goods from the supermarket on the other arm, and my phone is ringing, to answer that phone, maybe just with answer the phone as a speech and voice type of a thing, is an accessibility feature as well. So accessibility per definition does not necessarily mean that you have any kind of physical disability or any kind of mental aspects. It is something which probably, if you could spend maybe a sentence or two from your expert perspective, what that means.
So there are multiple aspects to it, but accessibility is sort of making sure that everybody can participate in society. So whether that's universal design of buildings and physical infrastructure, or the way that we design technology, and you can think of disability in different ways. So you already talked about situational disability. Essentially, you're unable to do something because of the situation you're in, because you're carrying things, you don't have access to your hands. You could be born with a limb difference, so you can't use your hands. And so really it's about making sure that people are able to complete tasks, whether they be physical or digital, in multiple different ways, and get a similar positive outcome from it. So when it comes to technical accessibility standards, they're well documented, and it's really then making sure that technologies behave in a consistent manner and that they work with the specialist assistive technologies that people with different disabilities use to be able to interact with mainstream technologies like your word processing or your email or your browser or whatever. So that's really sort of the technical aspect of accessibility. But of course, in order to make sure all of that works, you need all of the sort of organizational stuff that goes behind that, the policies and the processes and so on and so forth.
Thank you for that.
So let's talk a bit about AI. So AI is often called the next frontier, but you have said accessibility has been its driving force for decades. So how can leaders ensure new technologies like AI don't leave people behind?
So AI is machine learning, and actually many of the assistive technologies that I've been using and deploying for the last few decades are built on machine learning. So speech recognition, text-to-speech, image recognition, object recognition, these are all machine learning. And it's really, when we talk about AI now, we're talking about large language models and sort of the anthropomorphization of AI and the sort of conversational aspects. But machine learning's been there and it's been powering assistive tech for a long time. So there are real benefits to the disability and wider community from deploying the sort of broader sense of AI. At the same time, there are challenges as well, because if you think about AI models and if you think about how they work and how they're configured, they are looking for patterns. And if you think of humanity, and I am misquoting someone that is far better at this than me, Uta Treviranus, who is the AI and disability czar for the Canadian government, she talks about humanity being like a galaxy. And so when you're close to the center of the galaxy, there's density in the cluster. And at that point, AI is going to be pretty good at getting things right. The further away you get from the center of the galaxy, the less accurate AI is going to be in making the right decisions. And if you think about disability, it's extremely diverse. It's on the edges of that galaxy. And so the likelihood is that decisions taken by AI about people with disabilities are going to be wrong. And so it's having to think about the impact of that when you're building processes that automate decisions and that governments have that impact people's lives, whether that be a recruitment system or a system that is deciding whether someone gets parole or is entitled to benefits. These kind of systems have the sort of, they've learnt, and the data that they've learnt from has all of the embedded biases of society. So that requires us to engage with disability communities and other diverse communities during the design phase of technologies with AI, if we're to mitigate that bias.
Thanks for that picture again. And that, again, makes it, I think, much more grabbable. But coming to a couple of numbers that you may have then directly on hand and out of your mind. But I mean, we're not talking about, if you look at it from a percentage perspective, yeah, it might be just, I don't know, 2% of society who has any kind of a disability, visible disabilities. But if you go even further down, if you include mental topics, if you include maybe the whole aspect like you described it, and now combine that with a lack of staff, a lack of experts in already a lot of areas, I would question whether we are able, and if we as a society and as an economy are able to just wipe out that percentage, which is in fact, if you just shrink it maybe to Europe, might be millions of people who we just then wipe out and don't even include into our jobs. And I mean, driving an own company on my own, for me, I mean, if I have open positions, if I would have to drive my own business and I'm lacking to hire people who might be perfect for the job, but because of disability and the lacking of providing them a working surrounding which they are able to even include themselves and be part of the system, uh, I would guess that is something which we probably had been able to in the past, but won't be in the future anymore.
So I think we're clearly at an inflection point with this new technology. At the same time, when we have to think about how we deploy it, thank you to the Canadian government. They've already created and published an inclusive AI standard, so people can go and reference a standard about how to design AI systems inclusively. But people are benefiting too. So whilst I do have concerns about decision-making systems, clearly as someone that has my own hidden disabilities, I'm dyslexic, I have ADHD, it really supports my executive functioning. Having something that can take notes and give inferred actions after a meeting is fantastic for someone like me. So there are both upsides and downsides, and I think that the talk of total job destruction is hype. I think what you'll get is displacement. Roles will change. How we interact with technology will change. But some of the very basic roles that were fulfilled by people with maybe some more profound disabilities are higher risk because they're at risk of being automated away. And then that becomes a problem for society because these people are taxpayers right now. And you want, by creating inclusive employment and environments, you have people that are contributing to society in multiple ways. A, they're working, and B, they're paying taxes. If you take that away, then they're going to be recipients of benefits, and it's also bad for their health. So you're going to have these big societal impacts on economies around the globe. So I think that these are the sort of macro level concerns that people that think about sustainability and big picture mega trends over time are concerned about. So, we've had this conversation before we started recording about age and disability being interrelated. If you look at the global populations, and particularly Europe, particularly Asia, the demographic pyramid's turned on its head. So
Absolutely.
older people need to be able to support themselves, and yet age comes with a great likelihood of you acquiring health conditions and disabilities. We all age into disability. It's not something that you won't have. It's just a matter of time before you acquire one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. I mean, let's quickly jump into your own company, which you've co-founded, Access, which you've quickly just named in the introduction of you. Its purpose is just in a simple wording to connect thousands of advocates and technologists and people with disabilities. Out of that, what would be maybe one myth which that community might have debunked for you in regard of accessibility?
Well, so the Access chat community was something that grew organically over time. We have a podcast. We've been doing it since 2014. Yes, a long time anyway. And before social media morphed into something slightly more adversarial than it used to be, we grew a big community on there. I think that the myth that I'd like to debunk is that sort of accessibility and disability needs to be charitable. You can make good money from doing this stuff, and actually accessibility is and disability is a fantastic source of innovation. So if you think about many of the things that we are using today that are mainstream technologies, they were born out of people trying to solve challenges that people face in their day-to-day lives because they had a disability or a long-term health condition. Be that the typewriter, the telephone, speech recognition, text-to-speech. These are all things that were originally invented to solve problems of impairment and disability. So it's right at the sort of wellspring of innovation. So companies that invest in this actually are more profitable. And there was an EY study a few years back that said that companies that invested in disability inclusion were markedly more profitable. Accenture did a similar study. There's a return on disability index. So the myth is that companies are doing this because they want to do the right thing and be charitable. And actually, they should be doing it for all of those things, but it's also profitable. So they shouldn't be thinking of this just as a cost. And actually, one of the things that enabled us to grow within my previous business was the fact that we were also a profit center. Because when you change the management mind and they understand that you're a profit center, then they're willing to invest.
Wonderful. And just for the listeners who now might ask themselves how to connect with you and how to get in touch with Access and your podcast, we'll link that in the show notes here as well. And
Perfect. So you served on councils like the W3C Cognitive Accessibility Task Force. What's the policy or standard you wish every organization would adopt today?
That's quite interesting because the Cognitive Accessibility Task Force was, we were sort of like the naughty children of the Web Accessibility Task Force because we wanted all of the things that were difficult to do. So for people that don't know the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is the main open standard, they have sort of 3 rankings of success criteria that you need to meet. And the first ones, A and AA, are the ones that you must meet really to comply with the legislation, plus a few more for Europe. And then AAA tends to be the ones that are useful and helpful for people. Well, most of the people with cognitive accessibility needs, our needs are met in AAA. So we would love for people to think a bit more about implementing some of the AAA stuff, which is more akin to usability. Now, actually, usability has a really big payback anyway, because actually, if you think about how much fun it is working with ERP systems, I'm defining fun slightly widely here, or sort of submitting your tax form or any of these things. The processes are pretty horrible, and actually, there's money to be saved in making those processes easier to use and better.
thanks for that. And that reminds me, I did spend over Christmas quite some time to turn my own company's website, our own company's website, to AA to AA standard. And I tried to hit the AAA as well, but it was way too hard.
It's harder. It's a lot harder.
But good to know that this is then where the real music plays and where it's really then making an advantage. So good for reminding me, and we might have to get back on that again. So let's quickly jump in, as we've already added quite some time, Neil. We as Hoptrim, we focus on twin transformation. So the combination of digital and sustainable towards future viability. How do accessibility intersect with that type of a transformation from your point of view? And where do companies probably still fall short?
So I think there's a disconnect. People don't associate some of the accessibility stuff with sustainability, but actually it's in the ESG. It's the social aspect. And also to do it well in large organizations, you need good governance. So you've got the S and the G. And then what I tried to do in some of our projects was to find ways of working with my colleagues in sustainability and looking at resource consumption and energy use reduction to find ways to also link accessibility to the E. So one of the great projects that we did was with a small company called Equivalent Design, and what they did was they were working on accessible, scalable vector graphics, and so these could sort of expand to any size, and it was a tiny file size. So instead of multiple images for your website or your mobile app or whatever, you had one file size. They had embedded accessibility information in them. So they were fully accessible. They would work with assistive technologies, and they were faster. So again, what we were doing was we were making things more efficient, more accessible, and cheaper. So I think that there you can sort of, again, sort of create a virtuous circle by hitting all three things. And then within the organization I was working for, we aligned the accessibility strategy with the sustainability strategy. We started embedding inclusion initiatives into our double materiality analysis, and we actually built the frameworks around the same frameworks that you would use. We co-opted the decarbonisation framework. So you'd have the three different scopes. So direct, indirect, and influence. And that way people understood it. And we then started talking about, if you make something that's not accessible, has an impact on an individual, it's not you that pays, and therefore it's a negative externality. It's that individual or society that pays, in the same way that making a product that has a huge amount of a carbon footprint has an impact. So when we started talking about treating exclusion like pollution, people understood it and they could buy into it, and we already had a framework. So I think that if people want to sort of co-opt that framework or co-opt the frameworks that are already working within their business, that's a good way to make it easier to start adopting some of these practices and embedding them into the way that you do business.
I love that. And just based on my own history and my own experience, I've started in sustainability and in IT and didn't have accessibility on the radar, to be honest, as part of that role. But at the end, it was. And I don't regret a single moment to decide going that way. It's even more the other way around. It did enhance and just increase the experience in such a tremendous way for myself and make it much more explainable, exactly as I said it. So a shout out to all of our listeners who are in sustainability roles. If you haven't looked into accessibility, start by today and enhance your own spectrum and topics you're dealing with.
Perfect. So Neil, we have a tradition, the 1 week in transformation challenge. So what can our listeners do this week or today to review their own work for inclusivity, whether it's testing a website or a screen reader or reviewing hiring practice?
So I'm going to keep it pretty simple, actually. I think that if you're using Microsoft products and you're creating, let's just say presentations. Let's keep it really simple. If you're making a presentation or a Word document, use the accessibility checker that's built into Word and PowerPoint. It can review your document, leave it turned on, and then it's a bit like your spell checker. It will point out any errors. And it also gives you a really nice walkthrough of how to fix those accessibility errors. So not only will you end up with a more accessible document that can reach more people, but as part of that process, you're going to go through and learn, actually, this is not as difficult or as onerous as I thought it was going to be.
I love that. And we'll definitely share then next week how much of feedback we've granted. So please, if you're listening right now, if you have never tried out accessibility features in PowerPoint or Word, start doing so and comment in social media or here in the podcast how your experience was. And I can just, or probably would love to enhance that if you're posting on social media, always think about the alternative picture description. So that's something which is being featured in Instagram, in LinkedIn, and everywhere else. You can just hit an alternative description of an image, which is then for people with blindness or seeing disabilities to just have the ability to be with the screen reader described what's on that picture. But we have another tradition, Neil, and that is something which I I know already from the preparations up front, you'll give us a lot of good impulses, right?
Yeah, we have another tradition, as Rainer already said. So, Neil, which song would you add to our one day in transformation playlist? So, a track that embodies your mission or critical moment in your career.
So I got really greedy when I was asked about this because I have a love of music. So I've got 4 tracks to add to the playlist. So I started off old school. So if we want to be optimistic, I think Stepping Into Tomorrow by Donald Byrd, because we're at a point in history where we're looking forward to what technology can do.
Definitely.
If we're going to be pessimistic, similar period of time, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised by Gil Scott-Heron. So, you've got beat poetry and a commentary. Now, different era, but still, I think, relevant.
And just mentioning, we have international listeners, so we have people from Germany. Glass half empty, so that's the more pessimistic song then, maybe.
Yes.
No, it's just the bias, I know, stereotyping, but well, yeah. Just go ahead, please.
Yeah, and then growing up in the 80s and 90s, love a bit of indie. So I think a musical commentary on the AI boosterism of the moment. So Fool's Gold by the Stone Roses.
Yes.
and then something a bit more recent. And this is really just because it makes me smile. It's a song called 23 by an artist called Cleo Sol.
I love that. Cleo is, I think, from the UK and just a rising star, isn't she? I mean, she just rised up last year or by end of last year or something.
Yeah, that's early 2020s, doing a mix of jazz and soul and a really eclectic but really joyous kind of sound.
And an impressive voice, yeah, I can just emphasize. And you'll find all 4 songs, which I really love that you brought up the 4, even if we have in the past some of our podcast guests who had really hard times in even finding one song. So nothing to criticize, but you came up immediately with 4, and I love that, honestly. We'll put that on our playlist as well and share the link to that playlist here in the comment section then as well. Well, we're already coming to an end, Neil. The time flew by as never before, I have to be honest with you. So that was just roughly 40 minutes now with so much of impulses and thoughts. And thanks for your all time and for the inspiration and for reminding us that transformation starts with asking the question, who are we excluding, and then designing for them first. And as always, we'll, as already said, link to your work in the podcast show notes. We'll link to your profile. People who would love to reach out to you can either directly do so or contact us. And if you're inspired by the challenge with turning on the accessibility features, please do so and let us know and tag us at One Day in Transformation.
Just one thing. You can find the accessibility checker in the review pane of the toolbar in both Microsoft Word and in PowerPoint. So if you're wondering where it is, it's in the review pane.
Perfect. Thanks for that.
So stay tuned, and next time we'll dive into the renewable energy sources from the US. Until then, remember, as Pinky and the Brain would say, same time tomorrow, world domination.
World domination, yeah, absolutely.
So one day in transformation.
Thank you so much, Neil. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.